A noteworthy emphasis in John's gospel is that he repeatedly claims to be writing the truth. Sometimes he makes this quite explicit. The man who saw it has given testimony, and his testimony is true. John 19:35. The book has the strong ring of a claim of authenticity. And it reads like an eyewitness account. Years ago, the late novelist Dorothy Sayers, who was a very active professing Christian, by the way, commented that John's gospel is the only gospel that claims to be the direct report of an eyewitness. If you read John, you read the other three gospels, you'll notice that's true. She adds, and to anyone accustomed to the imaginative handling of documents, the internal evidence bears out this claim. There are lots of little hints that reinforce the idea that this indeed is the eyewitness testimony of somebody who was there. As Paul in 1 Corinthians 15:5-8 cites key appearances of Christ that turned cynics into disciples, John records a memorable incident that confirms Christ's identity and continuing presence to his disciples. That's what we'll be reading about here in chapter 21. The appearance would have been a vivid reminder to those who were there that Jesus, even after his crucifixion, still claimed and exercised authority over them. When he said to Peter in John 21:22, "Follow me," the words would have resonated with everybody there on that beach. These claims, it is John's hope, will have already by this point challenged any first-time reader to acknowledge who Jesus is and to find eternal life through commitment to him. But to drive home his point, this 21st chapter is kind of like a postscript to everything that he's written already. In fact, when you read the end of chapter 20, it sounds like perfect ending to the story. You know, it reads like the end of the book, which has caused some scholars to suggest that the gospel originally ended in chapter 20, verse 31. Chapter 21, they suggest, is a later addition. One commentator said it's anticlimactic at best and to some degree spoils the finale offered in the previous unit. However, there does not appear to be any evidence to support this other than just the opinion of commentators. There are no ancient copies of the Gospel of John that lack chapter 21. There's no documentary evidence anywhere that the Gospel originally lacked this final chapter. And even if it was added later, there is no reason why John himself could not have written that as well as the previous 20 chapters. So it's pure speculation that chapter 21 was added on later. And you can read the gospel with that in mind or without, and it really doesn't change anything. So let's look at chapter 21, the first 14 verses. After this, Jesus revealed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he revealed himself in this way. Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two others of his disciples were together. Simon Peter said to them, "I am going fishing." They said to him, "We'll go with you." They went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Just as day was breaking, Jesus stood on the shore, and yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, "Children, do you have any fish?" They answered him, "No." He said to them, "Cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because of the quantity of fish. The disciple whom Jesus loved therefore said to Peter, "It is the Lord." When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he was stripped for work, and threw himself into the sea. The other disciples came into the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, but about 100 yards off. When they got out on land, they saw a charcoal fire in place, with fish laid on it and bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you have just caught." So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore, full of large fish, 153 of them. And although there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Now none of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and so with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus was revealed to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. Verse 1 begins with it serves as a preference to the whole chapter. Afterward. After this, as it is in the ESV. It's an indefinite. It's impossible to say with any precision when this event happens. We know it is after the initial resurrection appearances on Easter and the following Sunday, and we know it's before his ascension. Beyond that, it's simply speculation. John uses the word the name Sea of Tiberias for what most of us grew up referring to as the Sea of Galilee. They were both recognized names for that body of water. It got the name Sea of Tiberias from the Romans, named after the emperor of that name. But it was in common usage, and in the Jewish historian Josephus, for instance, refers to the Sea of Tiberias, as do some of the early rabbinical writings. In his account, John lists a total of 7 disciples. John himself, as the disciple whom Jesus loved, was one of them. He doesn't talk about how it is that they happened to be there. Remember the last time we encountered them, they were in Jerusalem. Well, now they're nearly 100 miles to the north. But Galilee was their old stomping grounds. This was where most of them grew up, where they still had family and houses, and in the case of John and Andrew and the Zebedee brothers, a business. John merely relates that Peter's declaration to do something familiar and constructive rather than to sit by idly as they're waiting for their next instructions from their risen Lord. So while they're killing time, Peter says, "I'm going fishing." Now remember, this is not the same as if one of us were to say, "I'm going fishing." You know, for us it's recreation. For Peter it was his livelihood. You know, he's a commercial fisherman. Not all the guys who decided to go with him were fishermen, but it just seemed like a good idea. You know, they're sort of in a pause. They know that Jesus has risen from the dead, and in Mark's gospel he makes mention, he instructs them to wait for him in Galilee. So that may well be what we've got here. They've gone back there expecting to encounter Jesus again. In the meantime, you know, they're just, you know, marching in place. So why not do something constructive? You know, I've heard sermons preached and different things suggesting that somehow that this was sinful behavior on Peter to go back to his former way of life. I don't see it at all. I just see somebody looking for a worthwhile way to fill the hours and earn a little money alongside. In any event, he was singularly unsuccessful in the enterprise. You know, they fished at night. The Sea of Galilee, the entire body is well below sea level. And most of the time, there's a bright sun on that water. It gets hot. The fish during the daytime head to deeper waters. They're feeding near the surface at night. You know, we're not talking about commercial fishermen with these great big long drag lines like they use in the North Atlantic, where they can take a big scoop and scoop fish off the bottom. They had these nets that they threw out with their hands. It's weighted on one side, got floats on the other side. They get down in as far as they can and scoop up. So they're looking for fish near the surface. So they fish at night. It's in the early morning that the fish markets are open to buy their catch. They fish all night. Nothing. The sun is just coming up. Now let's imagine the scene here. Sea of Galilee, the lengthy, the long dimension of it runs north to south. Near about the 2/3 point going toward the north end is where it is at its widest. At that point, it's about 10 miles wide. Off to the east, where the sun is rising, you've got the high country on the far side. You know, as you're heading up into Ammon and the areas of Bashan, the old Jewish province of Bashan, all that area is there in the high country to the east. So the sun is coming up and the morning glare is coming across the water. In all likelihood, Jesus is on the western shore, because Cana and the area where the disciples fished and operated, it was on the west side. So Jesus is standing there on the bar. They don't recognize him. He's about 100 yards away. The light is still, you may well have morning mist coming off the water early in the morning. Jesus is looking right into the morning glare. And he tells them, "Hey boys, you catch any fish?" "Nah." "Throw your net on the other side and you'll catch some." Now, I've read speculation and heard preachers speculate that Jesus could see that there were fish on the other side of the boat. I think that's patent nonsense. When you think about the setting, all he was seeing was the glare of the early morning sun. The way the light would have struck that water, he wouldn't have seen anything under the surface from 100 yards away. The fact that he knew there were fish there had nothing to do with what he could see. It had everything to do with the fact that he was the eternal Son of God and he knew where every fish on the planet was at. It's interesting to note that every time the disciples are mentioned fishing in the Gospels, they never catch anything without Jesus' help. Have you ever noticed that? You wonder how they ate before they followed Jesus. Back in chapter 20, verse 8, John was the one who first realized, had the first insight about the resurrection. Now at the seaside, John's recognition of Jesus once again seems to run ahead of Peter. He said, "It's the Lord." Well, as soon as Peter heard it, and again, he stripped down for work. Now, I'm not an expert on Jewish undergarments of the first century. I don't know what kind of a garment that was he was wearing. But he did not want to meet the resurrected Lord, in the first century equivalent of his t-shirt. So he put his garment back on, and this is, a working man's clothes on a warm spring day. It wasn't a heavy garment. It's not like he's jumping overboard with a heavy wool robe on. But he put on whatever it was and got in the water and headed toward the shore. Now, again, it's not clear how deep the water was, whether he waded or had to swim a little bit. But whatever it was, he was able to manage it. And you would expect a man who'd spent his whole life on the water to be a pretty good swimmer anyway. Jewish protocol called for something more than underwear for the sacred greeting of shalom, peace, that Peter would be exchanging with Jesus. There's a proper way to go about this. It's a bit of a ritual. And so, it's like the old custom of men taking off their hat when introduced to a lady. There's just certain things that propriety calls for. And so that's what Peter is doing here. As the boat comes to the shore, there's a cheery scene waiting for them. I remember as a kid, our family would go camping there in the Missouri Ozarks where I grew up. And this was, we weren't going to KOA campgrounds. We'd load up typically the dad's pickup, and we'd put his 14-foot aluminum flat-bottom John boat in it, and we'd go out to a place where we could drive to a gravel bar on one of the Ozark rivers, and we'd put up our tent there right on the riverbank, and we'd fish and we'd swim, and we'd build a big fire there on the gravel bank, and we'd keep that campfire going day and night. And I have these wonderful memories of the feel and the smell of a campfire on the river in the early morning. It's just a unique collection of memories for me. The smell of the fire, the smell of the water and the fish that comes with that, the smell of stuff cooking on that fire, the chill of the mist of the early morning. It's all just, so it's easy for me to imagine what it must have been like that day. It's a great thing to come on, to be out fishing and come on a gravel bar and have a fire with fresh fish cooking. And there was Jesus. Doesn't say where he got the bread. Doesn't say where he got the fish. He demonstrates that he's not dependent upon the disciples nor to provide breakfast for them. Just as he fed the multitude, the 5,000, he can feed his disciples. But more food was called for. Perhaps Jesus simply wanted to call attention to the staggering proportion of their catch. So he said, give me some of the fish you caught. We'll add them to the cookout here. And at this point, Peter takes the task in hand. So Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore full of large fish, 153 of them. This was no small task. I don't know what that net full of fish would have weighed, but it was a substantial amount. How he was able to handle that all by himself, some have discussed and debated. It may just simply be that this is a guy who spent his whole life handling nets full of fish. This is what he does for a living, and he would know how to manage it as well as anybody. But you get the impression he's physically must have been pretty strong nonetheless. 153. Why that number? There have been libraries filled with commentaries speculating about the symbolic meaning of that 153. I'm not even going to bother repeating them because there's absolutely no basis for it. The number's 153 because that's how many fish were in the net. If there'd been 157, then that's what they would have written down. It's one of those little details that speaks of an eyewitness account. And it's the kind of thing that a commercial fisherman, having just made the biggest catch of his career, they would have counted. I remember on one of those fishing trips I talked about as a kid, we were night fishing, had a trot line across the river. If you know what those are like, you've got a long nylon rope that stretches from one bank to the other, and about every 3 feet you've got a short piece of line with a baited hook on it, and it's weighted down on the bottom. We were after catfish. We'd fished all weekend, we hadn't caught a thing. 6 a.m. We're making the morning run after having been sleeping for some hours, and my dad is taking in the line as we're checking it, and we're about halfway across the river, and something starts pulling the boat. And he says, "We've got something here." And as he takes it in, sure enough, there's this great big flathead catfish. It was the biggest fish we'd ever caught in our family. Now, that was years and years and years ago. I can still tell you, its gross weight was 26 pounds. It was 9 inches across right at the back of the head. And after we had butchered it, because a fish that big you don't clean, you butcher, we had 16 pounds of boneless fillet out of that catfish, which meant the ones right behind the head, cross sections, we had some catfish steaks 9 inches across and 1 inch thick without a bone in it, and it was good eating. But when you're a fisherman, you remember those kind of details. It was a big deal. It was a big deal when they brought 153. And notice he didn't just say fish, large fish. This was the kind of thing that would make a small businessman's season. This is recorded to be the 3rd time that Jesus appeared to the disciples. Now that is excluding his appearance just to Mary Magdalene. She was a disciple, but she wasn't one of the 12, and so that appearance was not listed as part of this. So everybody but Thomas has seen Jesus twice. Thomas has seen him once. They've been told to go to Galilee to wait for him, but there's still something a little, they're not in the least bit used to this. They're not blasé about the fact that a guy that they had watched executed had just cooked them breakfast. It still just seemed a little too weird. And John puts it this way, none of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. But the fact that the question even came to mind just speaks of the unsettled nature of what they're experiencing here. So they see Jesus off in the distance. They hear his voice. They come to the shore. They see the fish that he's cooking. They smell it. They taste it. They touch it. You see what's happening here? All 5 of their senses are brought to bear in this appearance. This is stuff that's going to be imprinted in their memory indelibly. It's like what I just said a moment ago. It's been over half a century since we were camping on those riverbanks in the Ozarks. And I still remember what it smelled like getting out of that old canvas tent and greeting the morning air there on the Merrimack River. When you get all your senses brought to bear on an experience, it really reinforces the memory. And that's what's happening. Jesus wants them to remember every detail. They are his witnesses. Verse 15 and following. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Feed my lambs." He said to him a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep. Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go." This he said to show by what kind of death he was to glorify God. And after saying this, he said to him, "Follow me." Remember in verse 7, it was Peter that jumped out of the boat. He wasn't going to wait for them to row it to shore. He was so anxious to meet Jesus again. Peter may well have been wrestling with continuing condemnation of guilty conscience in the wake of his threefold denial of his master. Now Jesus moves to make their mutual reconciliation both public and complete. As breakfast ended, he asked Peter 3 times, as Peter had denied him 3 times, to clarify the depth and quality of his commitment to Christ. "Do you love me more than these?" What's he mean? Do you love me more than this fishing business? These things that were once the center of your life that you abandoned when you went to follow me. That's theoretically possible. You know, the sea, the nets, the boat, your former way of life. It's more likely, I think, that what he is referring to is Peter's own prideful comments in Matthew 26:33 and in John 13:37 on the night of his betrayal. When Peter said, in effect, "I don't care what the rest of these guys do. I'm ready to die for you." In other words, I love you most. And so Jesus is turning it back on him. Is that true, Peter? Do you love me more than the rest of these guys? Well, Peter has learned some humility by this point. He doesn't say, "I love you more than them." He just simply affirms, "I love you." Peter's former pride has been tempered and transformed. Now, there's been a lot of ink spilled and a lot of painfully elaborated sermons over the shades of meaning attached to the Greek words love and lambs and sheep in verses 15, 16, and 17. I have been guilty of some of that myself in earlier years. The fact of the matter is, most scholars would agree that the differences are stylistic, not substantive. But Jesus, in other words, is saying the same thing 3 different times and just changing the words around a little bit for style's sake. There's not any profound, subtle meaning in the difference in the different kinds of Greek words used for love in this passage. Whether it's phileo, brotherly love, or agape, God's love. Because the fact of the matter is, those words are used interchangeably at times in the New Testament. Sometimes they do have a apparent unique meaning, but not always. And whether he talks about sheep or lambs or feeding or tending, the message is the same. The point of the exchange seems to be for Peter to have the opportunity to feel the sting of Jesus' thrice repeated query, just as Jesus felt the sting of Peter's thrice repeated denial. Now, this is not vengeful on the part of Jesus. This is cathartic. This is an opportunity for Peter. He was chastened and humbly vindicated. And now he can be fully restored to his former position. And just think a minute, what would have happened had this not happened? What if Jesus' attitude was, I'm just going to forget about this? Now, hear me carefully. There are lots of opportunities for Christians to do just that. Every time we have tension with another brother or sister in Christ doesn't require us to go through a long ordeal of reconciliation. What's the passage say? Love covers a multitude of sins. Sometimes just simply forgetting it and moving on is the easiest, fastest, and healthiest way to deal with conflict. The problem is, when we say we're going to forget it and move on and don't really forget it and move on, it just stays there kind of like a rock in our shoe. And every time we step on it, it irritates. When you've got those kind of situations, it needs to be dealt with. And in this case in particular, think of what the other disciples, if they haven't been saying it among themselves, they've all been thinking it. What has happened to Peter here? I mean, they all ran. But Peter was the one who lied repeatedly about even knowing Jesus. And Peter, after all, had been sort of the unofficial spokesman for the group over and over and over again in the Gospels. And Jesus will say something, and it's Peter that, he's the one that steps forward and kind of takes it upon himself to answer for everybody. So he clearly had some natural leadership ability, and they recognized him as such. It's just on the basis of his activity as a disciple, it is inconceivable to me that Peter could have been anything other than senior partner in that fishing business. He acted like the boss. But he's now been publicly disgraced by his cowardice. If Jesus says nothing, this is going to permanently limit Peter's effectiveness in the early church. He will, no matter what he does or says for the rest of his life, this is going to dog his steps. It's going to hound him. He's going to be the subject of gossip when he leaves the room. Boy, yeah, Peter sounded pretty good tonight, but you should have been there in the courtyard the night he denied ever knowing Jesus and swore with an oath that he didn't. So it was important for Peter, and it was important for the church, specifically the 12 or the other 10 of the remaining disciples, that this business be dealt with, that the boil be lanced, that the wound be cleansed, stitched up, and allowed to heal. Now he can be fully restored. He has been publicly examined, closely questioned by the risen Lord, absolved of his guilt, and given a fresh mandate. Jesus doesn't just say, "It's okay, Peter, I forgive you." But 3 times, he reminds him of his leadership role. Not only are you forgiven, you got to get back to work. Now that is full restoration. And it's not the way we do things in the church all too often, I'm afraid. For the outcome of the painful interview was an unqualified invitation to renew full commitment to the service of Christ. After saying this, he said to him, "Follow me." Now, there is this little parenthetical prophecy that Jesus offers at this point. Truly, truly, verily, verily. Remember, that's a solemn statement. This is the weight of Scripture here. Holy Writ, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted, but when you're old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go. This he said to show by what kind of death he was to glorify God. The image we have of Peter is of this big, burly, robust, independent guy. Kind of person who comes tromping through the house when he comes in. The kind of guy who is in charge of himself and his surroundings. And Jesus refers to who he was. He said, someday you're going to lose that independence. You're going to lose that ability to make your own choices. People are going to take you where you don't want to go. And it has been, from very early in the history of interpreting this passage, assumed that this imagery of him stretching out his hand was an oblique reference to the fact that he would die by crucifixion. Now, that Peter's crucifixion is not recorded in Scripture, but extremely ancient church tradition affirms that Peter was indeed crucified in Rome about the same time that Paul was beheaded. And again, a very, very old tradition says that he was crucified upside down after having said that he was unworthy to die in the same manner that his Lord did. Some helpful soldiers said, we can fix that. Okay, well, Peter's just gotten this kind of a mixed bag confrontation with Jesus. On the one hand, he's got behind him the unpleasantness of having to deal with that awful failure on the night of Jesus' betrayal. So he's feeling good about that. He's got a new commission. Then Jesus says, but you're going to pay a price for this new commission. Follow me for you is going to mean follow me right to the cross. Apparently, at this point, Jesus and Peter start to walk off by themselves. Because as we pick up the passage again in verse 20, Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them. The one who also had leaned back against him during the supper and had said, Lord, who is it that's going to betray you? When Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, Lord, what about this man? Jesus said to him, if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me. So the saying spread abroad among the brothers that this disciple was not to die. But Jesus did not say to him that he was not to die, but if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? We can only speculate as to exactly what Peter is thinking at this point. Maybe he's thinking to himself, man, that's pretty tough news. This is something I'm going to have to do all by myself. What about him? What's wrong with him, Lord? How about John? He's a fisherman too. A more charitable interpretation would simply be, Jesus has offered to Peter an insight into the future. Maybe he's got a word for John as well. And they start walking away from the group, I guess, in conversation, and Peter just kind of half turns his head, and John is kind of tagging along. And so, he kind of brings John into the circle. Lord, what about him? Again, maybe this is just Peter acting in his role as sort of the unofficial leader of the group. In Jesus' answer to Peter's question, two issues are raised. First, John's future is really none of Peter's business. And Jesus makes that quite clear. He basically says, Peter, you got more than enough on your plate just managing to run your own life without trying to micromanage John's. Just keep focused on the task you've got in front of you. It's going to keep you busy. Your integrity as a Christ follower is your primary task. The second issue raised is the rumors that got started because of what Jesus said about John. Again, think about the setting. Prior to the writing of John's Gospel, nearly all the rest of the New Testament was written. The only other book that is probably newer than John is the Revelation. By this point, the other three Gospels have almost certainly all been written. All of Paul's letters have long been written. Peter's letters had been written. James was one of the first things written. You read the rest of the New Testament, especially reading Paul's epistles and Peter's letters, it is filled with imagery about and the obvious expectation of the early church that Jesus was coming back soon. The imminent return of Jesus Christ. When Jesus ascended into heaven, I guarantee you that the men standing there on the Mount of Olives looking up fully expected to see him come back before they died. And for the first several decades of the early Christian history, that was the universal expectation. Jesus was coming back soon. It's the reason that the Gospels weren't written down for decades. Who needs to write a book when you got eyewitnesses who can tell you about it? It's only when the witnesses started to die off that suddenly they realized if we don't write this stuff down, there's not going to be anybody to accurately relate to people what happened. And so it became important. And the fact that John doesn't write this down until probably about 90 AD in no way takes away from the fact that all of the disciples there who heard that heard it and thought, well, wow, no guarantee about the rest of us. Peter apparently is not going to make it. But John, apparently John's going to be here when Jesus comes back. At least he will be. And so he sort of becomes the barometer for the early church. Well, John's still alive, so... It's kind of like, do you ever wonder about when God leveled the curse on Israel as they were wandering in the desert, their rebellion there at the foot of Mount Sinai? And he said, every man and woman over the age of 20 will die in the desert. They won't step foot into the promised land. And 40 years later, somewhere, some old Jewish man or woman finally died, and the word went through the camp, the last one's gone. We can enter the camp. It's about time she finally kicked the bucket. You know there had to have been a death watch. But the fact of the matter is, it's like so many things that happen in church life. It was a misunderstanding of something that was stated, and it was repeated as fact. And that's never what Jesus said. Basically, all he was saying was, Peter, mind your own business. John's future is John and my business, not yours. Don't read into what I said things that I didn't say. Then we have these last two verses. Verse 24, this is the disciple who's bearing witness about these things and who has written these things, and we know that his testimony is true. Yet another categorical assertion that the writer knows whereof he speaks. This is John's way of saying, this isn't hearsay. I was there. I saw it. This is how it happened. You can take it to the bank. I solemnly swear, I, John, saw what I have written down. It's that kind of a statement. After that declaration, there is a disclaimer. Now, there are also many other things that Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. The gospel ends with a delightful overstatement. It's a way of John reminding us that he has been very sparing and very selective in what he included in his gospel. He deliberately left out lots and lots of stuff. And he engages in a little hyperbole. The world couldn't hold all the books that could be written. I don't read that literally, but it's just simply a way of saying, yeah, you don't know the half of it, folks. This is just the icing on the cake. There's so much more I could have told you. John wrote what he needed to write for a specific purpose. It was the purpose that he reminded us about in chapter 20, verse 31, that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. It is not by accident that when missionaries attempt to reach a previously unreached people group with a language in which the scriptures have never before been translated, almost without exception, the first book they translate is the Gospel of John. I remember years ago when I was working up in the Minnesota-Wisconsin Baptist Convention, we had a large Hmong community. The Hmong people were from Southeast Asia, the hill people in the mountains north of Laos. They fought on the side of the U.S. forces during the Vietnam War. And when the war ended and we were run out of the country, their lives were in check. I mean, it was bad time for them. And so en masse, they fled as refugees to Thailand, and many of them eventually ended up in the United States. And I remember we had a significant number of Hmong churches, and one of their early accomplishments was to translate and publish the Gospel of John in the Hmong language. And you can go to a place like the headquarters of the Wycliffe Bible translators, and you can see copies of the New Testament, and in many cases copies of the Gospel of John in thousands of different languages. Well, there's a reason they start with John and not Leviticus. If your primary goal is to start winning converts to Jesus in a people group, what better tool can you get than the Gospel of John? The Gospel which was written, the purpose of which is spelled out by the author, that you might hear and understand and believe. And to that end, it has served admirably. Through John's Gospel, Christ continues to give light to every man. As the cross that brought him death, yet glory wins eternal redemption for whoever believes. And that, folks, concludes the Gospel of John. And we got done early, but chapter 21 was a little short.